Hello, this is Francis talking to you from Maceda. Behind me is a A-7P Corsair 2, a version of the classic A-7 of the US Navy developed for the Portuguese Air Force. Now, why did the Portuguese use during the 80s and 90s these strike aircraft from the 60s? Well, the story of the Portuguese in the jet age in terms of combat aircraft goes back to the 50s when we received our first F-84s, Thunderjets. The F-84 was essentially the first jet fighter that the Portuguese Air Force had. So, but it was a platform developed as a fighter, but it was at that time it was already only really useful for ground attack. Thus, what happened was that the Portuguese needed air superiority fighter. That's when we received the F-86 Sabres. The Sabres were a really favorite aircraft for the Portuguese pilots. However, the Americans didn't allow us to use them in the African wars. Thus, we started to use Fiat G91s imported from Germany. However, what happened was that once the war was over and the Portuguese started to rethink their air force, it was realized that both the Sabres and the Fiat were hopelessly outdated. Thus, a program started to find a replacement for both the G91 and the Sabres. At first, the Portuguese Air Force was really interested in F4 Phantoms, but they didn't have money for that. Airplanes passing by, now that's cool. Anyways, we didn't have money for that. Another idea was to find some F5 Tigers that we could use. In fact, the idea to have the F5s was so strong that we even acquired some T-38 training jets, which became an important training jet for the Portuguese Air Force until they were replaced by the Alpha jets a bit later. And this I'm talking about in the 70s. However, we didn't have money even for the F5s. Portugal was and still is a very poor country, and even more so after 13 years of war in Africa. So, it was the Americans themselves that offered the idea of us acquiring the A7s. Now, how will this work? These A7s were not brand new. They're actually older A7 planes that were put out of service in the US Navy, and then updated with some more modern avionics to make them NATO compatible at the time. So in the end of the 70s, early 80s, Portugal started to receive the so-called A-7Ps. These planes, they serve their goal of replacing the older early Cold War jets. However, they are strike aircraft. They are not really good for air defense, although they can use these missiles, the AIM-9s, but it's only for self-defense. They could have a good use as surface strike or ground strike, which was their main goal. But they were old, they were outdated, and eventually they were replaced by the F-16s. Actually, these planes were so old that when the last ones were put off the service in '99, they were actually falling from the skies. They started to fall apart, and there were several accidents which led to their retirement. Now, the A-7 itself is a really interesting platform. This plane was developed as a ground strike already, as a ground strike aircraft, already with some lessons learned from Vietnam. The base structure actually came from the F-8 Corsair, which was a prime air defense fighter for the US Navy. What happened was that the Navy required a precision strike airplane, something with better capacity than the A4 Skyhawk. Thus, Vogt modified the F-8 design to incorporate the TF-30 jet and ground tech weapons, as well as two 20mm guns. And they actually made one of the most revolutionary ground strike fight aircraft in history. It was actually the first plane to have an HUD in the cockpit. These planes, as I said, eventually gave a great service to the Portuguese Air Force. They also served in the Greek Air Force, and they are remembered with a lot of love by their fans in Portugal, North America and Greece.